For the Romans, Britain was little more than a distant land shrouded in mist, lying beyond the limits of the civilized world they believed they knew. Ancient accounts describe the island as a place of unfamiliar peoples, strange customs, and uncertain riches, closer to myth than to reality. When the name Britain began to circulate in Rome, it came surrounded by rumors, exaggerations, and a curiosity that was hard to ignore. Julius Caesar heard these stories while consolidating his power on the European continent, attentive to anything that might expand Roman influence. The idea of an island at the edge of the known world started to take shape on maps and in the Roman imagination. It was not only about territory, but about prestige, control, and expansion. And it was from this distant and inquisitive gaze that a long and complex history began to unfold. To understand the history of the United Kingdom, it is necessary to follow a temporal arc that stretches across millennia, from British prehistory to the contemporary world. Throughout this journey, the territory of Great Britain was shaped by migrations, conquests, cultural transformations, and profound political changes. Different peoples occupied the island, leaving lasting marks on its social organization, language, and institutions. The history of Great Britain did not develop in a linear way, but rather as a succession of overlapping historical layers. Each era contributed to the formation of England and the modern United Kingdom. It is from this broad perspective that this narrative begins. Early British prehistory dates back to a time when Great Britain did not yet exist as an isolated island, but rather as an extension of the European continent, connected by vast plains that are now submerged. During the Paleolithic period, human groups crossed these regions while following herds of large animals, adapting to an environment shaped by severe glacial cycles and long periods of climatic instability. Survival depended directly on hunting, gathering roots and fruits, and the ability to move according to the seasons. Stone tools were produced using simple yet effective techniques, allowing food processing in the construction of temporary shelters. At this remote stage, the history of Great Britain was deeply connected to the natural dynamics of continental Europe. Every human movement reflected a direct response to environmental conditions. British prehistory therefore begins as part of a broader framework of ancient European history. This initial context shaped the foundations of human occupation in the territory. Over time, climatic transformations decisively altered the landscape of the region. The gradual end of the glacial ages caused ice sheets to melt and sea levels to rise, a process that ultimately led to the definitive separation of Great Britain from the continent. This geographic event had profound effects on British prehistory, as it redefined migration routes and isolated human populations that had previously moved freely. During the Mesolithic period, communities began to exploit local resources more intensively, such as rivers, forests, and coastal zones. Fishing became an essential activity, complementing the hunting of smaller animals. Tools became increasingly specialized, reflecting a growing understanding of the environment. The history of Great Britain started to develop distinct characteristics from those of the continent. This gradual isolation influenced the cultural development of local populations. Adapting to the new insular environment required constant changes in survival strategies. Mesolithic communities established seasonal camps in strategic locations, close to water sources and areas rich in natural resources. The use of microliths, small stone blades, demonstrates important technical advances within British prehistory. These instruments allowed greater efficiency in hunting and in the manufacture of composite tools. The history of Great Britain during this period was not marked by large population centers, but by dispersed networks of mobile communities. Even so, these groups established a continuous occupation of the territory. This continuity was fundamental for the transformations that would follow. The historical timeline of the region advanced gradually and quietly. The beginning of the Neolithic period represented a structural shift in ancient history of Great Britain. The introduction of agriculture profoundly altered the relationship between humans and nature, reducing exclusive dependence on hunting and gathering. The cultivation of crops and the domestication of animals allowed greater predictability in food supply. As a result, the first more durable settlements began to appear, although still small and scattered. Polished stone tools came into use, indicating new techniques and greater investment in manual labor. British prehistory entered a phase of social reorganization, marked by greater territorial stability. Human occupation became more permanent, transforming the natural landscape. The history of Great Britain began to show clear signs of continuous human intervention. These processes unfolded over centuries, without abrupt breaks. Within this context of progressive sedentism, monumental constructions emerged that still stand today. Structures such as Stonehenge were built as part of a collective process involving planning, the transport of large stone blocks, and coordination among different groups. These constructions did not arise in isolation, but were embedded within broader cultural transformations of British prehistory. They indicate the existence of communities capable of mobilizing labor on a large scale. The landscape of Great Britain became marked by permanent, visible, and enduring features. These monuments served as important territorial references. The history of Great Britain began to leave material records that would endure for millennia. These remains provide direct evidence of social changes during the period. At this point, the historical timeline gains greater material density. Neolithic transformations also affected relationships between different human communities. Gradual population growth intensified contacts among neighboring groups, encouraging exchanges of objects, techniques, and knowledge. Circulation networks began to form, linking different regions of the island. At the same time, the need to organize the use of cultivated land became increasingly evident. British prehistory started to show early signs of social differentiation, though without formal political structures. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals societies in transition, adjusting to new forms of production. The territory ceased to be merely a space of passage and became a space of permanence. These changes did not occur uniformly, varying according to region. Regional diversity was already present from the earliest times. This factor would influence later stages in the formation of England. By the end of this long initial period, Great Britain displayed a consolidated human base deeply integrated with the territory. Agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental constructions irreversibly transformed the landscape. British prehistory established the necessary conditions for the emergence of new technologies and forms of social organization. British prehistory thus moved towards a stage in which the use of metals would become central. The territory was prepared for even deeper changes in the structure of human societies. The historical timeline continued its interrupted course. The transition to the Bronze Age did not represent a rupture, but an expanded continuity. It is within this setting that the historical narrative advances, moving towards a new period of material and social transformation. The Neolithic period in Great Britain marked a time of profound cultural transformations in which the relationship between human communities and the environment underwent a gradual and continuous reorganization. Agriculture ceased to be a sporadic practice and became a structural part of daily life, with the cultivation of cereals and the raising of domesticated animals expanding across different regions. This process did not occur uniformly, varying according to soil quality, climate, and available resources. Sedentism advanced progressively, with human groups remaining longer in specific areas. The landscape began to be shaped by cultivated fields and recurrent paths of movement. At this moment, the history of Great Britain began to record more enduring human interventions. British prehistory entered a phase of greater territorial stability. These changes established new foundations for social organization. With the establishment of more durable settlements, new dynamics of coexistence and cooperation emerged among human groups. Dwellings were built with greater planning, using local materials and techniques adapted to the environment. Remaining in the same territory for extended periods encouraged the development of collective practices, such as food storage and shared land management. The ancient history of Great Britain reveals that these communities were not isolated, but maintained frequent contact with neighboring groups. Exchanges of seeds, tools, and knowledge became more common. The Neolithic period promoted an intensification of social relations. Territorial occupation began to reflect collective decisions and informal agreements. The historical timeline records during this period an increase in social complexity. These transformations unfolded over generations without abrupt breaks. Cultural transformations at a Neolithic period also manifested visibly across the British landscape. Stone monuments, collective tombs, and ceremonial structures began to be erected in different regions. These constructions required organization, division of labor, and coordination among multiple groups. British prehistory started to leave material traces that went beyond immediate survival needs. The construction of these monuments was integrated into social life and land use. The history of Great Britain began to be recorded through these enduring structures. They became reference points within the landscape, connecting communities to the spaces they occupied. The Neolithic consolidated long-term collective practices. These remains reinforce the cultural complexity of the period. The increase in food production contributed to a gradual population growth in the Neolithic Great Britain. With more people occupying the territory, new forms of organizing space and labor emerged. Cultivable areas began to be delineated and used more systematically. The need to plan land use became increasingly evident. The ancient history of Great Britain shows that these changes altered community dynamics, expanding social interactions. Cooperation became essential to ensure the continuity of harvests and the maintenance of settlements. British prehistory advanced toward more stable social structures. These transformations did not eliminate mobility, but reduced its central role. The territory came to be perceived as a space of permanence. Networks of contact between different regions of the island intensified during the Neolithic period. Objects made of stone, ceramics, and other materials circulated among communities, indicating the existence of well-established exchange routes. These networks not only enabled the movement of goods, but also of ideas and techniques. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals increasing interconnection among distinct regions. Cultural diversity expanded as local practices combined with external influences. British prehistory was not homogeneous, but marked by significant regional variations. Each community adapted Neolithic practices to its specific conditions. The historical timeline reflects this multiplicity of experiences. This setting contributed to the cultural richness at a period. Cultural transformations at a Neolithic period also affected how communities related to time and space. Observation and natural cycles became even more important for agricultural planning. Harvest calendars began to guide a significant part of social life. The construction of monuments aligned with natural phenomena indicates accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The history of Great Britain records at this point a deeper integration between cultural practices and the environment. British prehistory reveals societies increasingly attentive to the regularity of natural cycles. These practices were embedded in daily life without written records. The territory was understood through shared experiences. Such cultural transformations shaped collective life in lasting ways. By the end of the Neolithic period, Great Britain presented a landscape profoundly transformed compared to earlier times. Agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental constructions had redefined both the environment and social relations.
British prehistory established a solid cultural base upon which new technologies would be incorporated. The history of Great Britain moved toward a stage marked by the use of metals and even broader changes. The Neolithic did not represent an endpoint, but a phase of continuous transition. The historical timeline continued its course, integrating past and present gradually. The territory was prepared for new forms of production and social organization. It is within this context that the historical narrative advances to the next phase of material and cultural transformations.
The Bronze Age in Great Britain began with the gradual introduction of metallurgy, a process that profoundly transformed the human societies already established across the territory. The use of bronze, an alloy made from copper and tin, created new technical possibilities for the production of tools, weapons, and ornaments. These innovations did not emerge abruptly, but were incorporated over time, initially coexisting with stone implements. Obtaining raw materials required specialized knowledge and access to regions where metals were available. The history of Great Britain began to record an expansion of the technical abilities of its communities. British prehistory advanced toward a stage of greater material complexity. Mastery of metal altered daily practices and work routines. This period marked an important transition in the historical timeline. With the development of metallurgy, networks of contact between different regions of the island expanded significantly. Tin, abundant in areas such as Cornwall, became a strategic resource within the history of Great Britain. Communities began to maintain regular contacts for the exchange of metals, objects, and technical knowledge. These trade routes connected distant regions, integrating Great Britain into broader circuits of the European world at a time. The circulation of metal goods encouraged cultural exchange between distinct groups. The Bronze Age consolidated exchange practices that extended beyond immediate local needs. British prehistory became characterized by greater regional interdependence. The territory became part of a continuous network of circulation. This process contributed to the cultural diversity observed during the period. Technological changes during the Bronze Age also affected the social organization of British communities. The production of metal objects required specialized skills, leading to the emergence of individuals or groups dedicated to these activities. Possession of bronze weapons and ornaments began to distinguish certain members of the community. The history of Great Britain records at this stage clearer signs of social hierarchy. Burials and funerary practices started to show significant variation in grave goods. These differences indicate distinctions of status within communities. British prehistory advanced toward more stratified social structures. Access to metals became a relevant factor in collective organization. These transformations occurred gradually and varied by region. The use of bronze directly influenced subsistence and defensive practices. More durable and efficient tools expanded agricultural and craft productivity. Bronze weapons altered the way local conflicts were conducted, even though no written records describe specific confrontations. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals continuous adaptation to new technical possibilities. Agricultural production benefited from stronger implements, contributing to the stability of settlements. The Bronze Age did not eliminate earlier practices, but integrated them with new technologies. British prehistory retained Neolithic elements, now combined with metal use. The territory continued to be intensively exploited. These changes reinforced the permanence of communities within the spaces they occupied. The British landscape was also transformed during the Bronze Age through new forms of land occupation and territorial marking. Funerary monuments, such as round barrows, became more common across various regions. These structures required collective planning and indicate the continuity of complex social practices. British history began to be recorded through these enduring constructions. They functioned as territorial and social reference points within the landscape. British prehistory maintained the tradition of erecting monumental structures, now associated with new material values. The use of bronze expanded the variety of objects linked to these monuments. The historical timeline reveals an increasingly human-shaped landscape. These remains remain central sources for the study at a period. Communities at a Bronze Age in Great Britain continued to display significant regional variation. Differences in access to metals, funerary practices, and object styles reflect the cultural diversity at a territory. The history of Great Britain during this period was not uniform, but composed of multiple local experiences. Some regions integrated more intensely into trade networks, while others maintained more traditional practices. British prehistory shows a coexistence of innovation and continuity. The use of bronze was adapted to the specific conditions of each area. This diversity contributed to the cultural complexity observed in the archaeological record. The historical timeline highlights this multiplicity of trajectories. The British territory consolidated its internal diversity. By the end of the Bronze Age, Great Britain displayed societies that were more complex in both material and social terms. Mastery of metallurgy had redefined daily practices, exchange relations, and forms of social differentiation. The history of Great Britain moved toward a stage in which new technologies and collective organizations would become even more prominent. British prehistory established during this period important foundations for future transformations. The use of bronze did not represent an endpoint, but a stage within a continuous process. The historical timeline continued its constant movement. The territory was prepared for the introduction of new materials and forms of organization. It is within this setting that the historical narrative advances to the next phase of transformation, marked by the use of iron.
The Iron Age in Great Britain marked a decisive transformation in the organization of human societies that already occupied the territory. Mastery of iron metallurgy enabled the production of tools and weapons more durable than those made of bronze, expanding the technical possibilities of local communities. This advance did not occur suddenly, but was gradually incorporated into existing practices. The introduction of iron altered agricultural, artisanal, and defensive activities, influencing everyday life. The history of Great Britain began to record societies that were more densely organized and territorially defined. British prehistory advanced toward a phase of greater social and material complexity. The use of iron became a central element of daily routines. This period established the foundations for the consolidation of Celtic peoples on the island. Celtic peoples came to occupy much of Great Britain during the Iron Age, organizing themselves into distinct tribes with their own identities. These communities shared similar cultural practices, yet displayed significant regional variations. Social organization was based on kinship ties, local alliances, and tribal leadership. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals a multiplicity of groups that coexisted and interacted continuously. The Celts developed a rich material culture, expressed through metal objects, ceramics, and ornaments. British prehistory became marked by a more clearly defined cultural identity. The territory was divided into areas of tribal influence. These divisions shaped spatial occupation in lasting ways. Settlements of the Iron Age in Great Britain reflected the defensive and social needs of Celtic communities. Fortifications, known as hill forts, became common across many regions, positioned on strategic elevations. These structures served as centers of habitation, protection, and community organization. Their construction required collective planning and coordinated labor. The history of Great Britain began to be recorded through these fortified landscapes. British prehistory at this stage displayed a more visible and structured territorial occupation. Hill forts functioned as political and economic reference points. They also facilitated control over routes and local resources.
The economy of Iron Age Celtic societies in Great Britain was primarily based on agriculture and animal husbandry. The use of iron tools increased the efficiency of cultivation and food production. Agricultural surplus made it possible to sustain larger populations and more stable settlements. The history of Great Britain during this period shows an intensification of land use. Alongside agriculture, artisanal activities gained prominence, especially metalworking and a production of decorative objects. British prehistory began to integrate economy, culture, and territory in a more articulated manner. Exchanges between neighboring communities became more frequent. These practices strengthened regional networks of contact. During the Iron Age, Great Britain also maintained indirect contacts with the Mediterranean world. Objects of foreign origin found at archaeological sites indicate the existence of exchange networks connecting the island to more distant regions. These contacts did not imply external domination, but encouraged the circulation of goods and ideas. The history of Great Britain reveals that Celtic peoples were not isolated from the rest of Europe. British prehistory selectively incorporated external influences. Coins, artistic styles, and specific techniques reflect these interactions. The British territory became part of a broader framework of European connections. These exchanges increased the cultural diversity of local communities. Cultural and social practices among Celtic peoples were transmitted mainly through oral tradition. Without their own written records, knowledge was preserved through narratives, rituals, and shared customs. The history of Great Britain during this period is reconstructed through material remains and later accounts. British prehistory presents societies with complex systems of belief and symbolic organization. Natural spaces, such as rivers and forests, played central roles in collective life. These practices were integrated into daily routines without a clear separation between social and ritual spheres. The territory was understood as an active part of community life. These characteristics deeply shaped Celtic identity in Great Britain. By the end of the Iron Age, Great Britain displayed a mosaic of well-established and territorially organized Celtic societies. Mastery of iron, tribal consolidation, and regional networks of contact had profoundly structured social life. The history of Great Britain moved toward a moment of greater external visibility. British prehistory approached its conclusion, preparing the setting for more direct contact with foreign powers. The territory was politically fragmented, yet culturally integrated through shared practices. The timeline continued its uninterrupted course. It is in this context that the narrative advances to the first direct encounters between Great Britain and the Roman world.
The first Roman contacts with Great Britain occurred within a broader context of Roman expansion and consolidation across the Mediterranean world and northwestern Europe. As Roman campaigns advanced through Gaul, information about the island beyond the English Channel became increasingly present in political and military circles. Reports mentioned Celtic peoples, natural resources, and contact routes linking the island to the continent. The history of Great Britain began to enter the Roman sphere of observation as part of a wider strategic landscape. These early contacts did not arise by chance, but from interests related to security, prestige, and territorial recognition. British prehistory approached an unprecedented moment of external exposure. The territory, until then outside Roman control, began to be considered within imperial decision-making. This process marked the opening of a new phase in the historical timeline. Julius Caesar played a central role in these early encounters by leading expeditions to Great Britain during his campaigns in Gaul. In 55 BC, Roman forces crossed the Channel with the objectives of reconnaissance and the demonstration of power. The Roman arrival met resistance from local groups that already maintained connections with the continent.
The landing was marked by initial clashes and limited negotiations. The history of Great Britain records this episode as a direct contact, still limited in scope and duration. Roman forces did not establish a permanent occupation, but gathered valuable information about the territory and its inhabitants. British prehistory began to be observed through Roman written records. This first encounter established mutual references between Romans and local peoples. The territory entered the Roman political horizon. In the following year, 54 BC, a new Roman expedition returned to Great Britain with larger forces and broader objectives. This time, Roman troops advanced further into the territory, establishing contact with different Celtic groups. Armed confrontations, temporary alliances, and negotiations with local leaders took place. The history of Great Britain at this moment reveals a complex interaction marked by resistance and adaptation. The Romans sought to impose their presence through military force and strategic agreements. Even so, occupation remained temporary. British prehistory had not yet transformed into effective Roman rule. The expeditions functioned as a rehearsal for future actions. Contact expanded Roman knowledge of local geography and politics. These first contacts produced immediate effects on societies in Great Britain, even though they did not result in formal conquest. Roman presence introduced new objects, practices, and external references into the territory. Coins, goods, and symbols of Roman power circulated in a limited manner among local communities. The history of Great Britain records this moment as a moment of intensified contact with the Mediterranean world. Local leaderships began to consider Rome as a relevant actor in regional relations. British prehistory started to selectively incorporate external elements. The territory was not administratively reorganized, but began to be observed from the outside. These initial interactions altered the political balance among tribes. The local landscape became more dynamic and interconnected. From the Roman perspective, the first contacts provided essential strategic information for future assessments. Reports concerning climate, logistics, resources, and local alliances were carried back to the continent. The history of Great Britain began to appear in Roman texts as part of a known, though uncontrolled, space. These records shaped Roman perceptions of the island over the following decades. British prehistory, previously reconstructed only through material remains, now coexisted with external written sources. The territory was initially mapped and incorporated into imperial planning. These data influenced later decisions regarding military intervention. The initial contact, therefore, had long-lasting effects on Roman policy. The historical timeline advanced toward a new stage of observation and preparation. Local societies also responded in varied ways to these early encounters. Some leaders sought strategic alliances with the Romans, while others intensified resistance. The history of Great Britain reveals a range of responses, differing according to region and local circumstances. Contact with Rome did not result in uniform behavior among Celtic peoples. British prehistory maintained its internal diversity, now under growing external influence. The territory became a stage for internal political disputes, amplified by the Roman factor. These dynamics altered power relations among tribes. The local landscape began to be shaped by expectations and concerns related to Roman presence. The initial contact, though limited, produced real political effects. Instability increased in certain areas of the territory. By the end of these first contacts, Great Britain remained outside direct Roman control, but was no longer an unknown land. The history of Great Britain had entered a phase of regular contact with an external power. British prehistory approached its conclusion as an isolated period. The territory came to be viewed as a concrete possibility for future intervention. The historical timeline continued its course, linking the island to broader processes of the Roman world. These early contacts did not complete Roman presence, but established the foundations for later actions. The setting was prepared for deeper changes. It is within this context that the narrative advances to the phase of conquest and effective Romanization of Britain.
The Roman conquest of Britain began decisively in AD 43, when Emperor Claudius authorized a large-scale military campaign to bring the territory under Roman control. Unlike Julius Caesar's earlier expeditions, this operation aimed to establish permanent domination and integrate the region into the Roman Empire. Legions crossed the English Channel and advanced gradually through the southeast of the island, facing organized resistance from local tribes. At this moment, the history of Great Britain entered a new phase marked by continuous military presence. British prehistory gave way to a period documented by Roman administrative and military records. The territory began to be reorganized according to imperial standards. The conquest did not occur instantly, but through successive campaigns. The historical timeline became directly influenced by decisions made in Rome. After the initial consolidation of military control, the Romans began installing a structured administration in Britain. Governors were appointed to supervise the territory on behalf of the emperor, ensuring the application of Roman law and the collection of taxes. The history of Great Britain became integrated into the political system of the Roman Empire. Cities were founded or reorganized following Roman urban models, with forums, administrative buildings, and public spaces. British prehistory gave way to a society increasingly regulated by imperial norms. The territory was divided into administrative units to facilitate control and governance. Roman presence became visible in the daily lives of local populations. Romanization did not immediately eliminate earlier practices, but introduced new political references. This process was gradual and varied by region. Infrastructure played a central role in consolidating the Roman Empire in Britain. An extensive network of roads was constructed to connect urban centers, military forts, and productive areas. These routes facilitated the movement of troops, goods, and information across the territory. The history of Great Britain became marked by an unprecedented level of physical integration. Bridges, aqueducts, and water supply systems were implemented in many cities. British prehistory, characterized by dispersed occupations, gave way to a more organized and connected space. The territory became a functional part of the empire. These projects required local labor and Roman technical planning. The British landscape was profoundly transformed. The historical timeline records this period as one of structural change. Roman military presence remained constant throughout the occupation of Britain. Forts and legionary camps were established at strategic points, especially along the borders of conquered territory. These structures ensured internal security and defense against external groups. The history of Great Britain came to coexist with a permanent armed force. British prehistory had never experienced a military apparatus of such scale and organization. The legions also performed administrative and logistical functions. Soldiers participated in the construction of roads, walls, and public buildings. The territory was systematically monitored. This presence reinforced Roman control and regional stability. Romanization advanced alongside the militarization of space. The economy of Roman Britain was integrated into the broader economic system of the Roman Empire. Natural resources such as metals and agricultural products were exploited and distributed through imperial networks. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals an intensification of production and trade. Roman coinage circulated widely, replacing earlier economic practices. British prehistory, based on local exchange systems, was gradually replaced by a standardized monetary economy.
Goods from other regions of the empire arrived in Britain. The territory became an active participant in Roman trade routes. This economic integration altered patterns of consumption and production. Local communities began interacting with wider markets. The daily life of Britain's populations was deeply transformed by Roman presence. New customs, architectural styles, and forms of social organization were introduced, particularly in urban areas. The history of Great Britain records a coexistence between local traditions and Roman practices. British prehistory did not disappear entirely, but was gradually incorporated into a new cultural context. Public baths, rural villas, and urban spaces became common in certain regions. Latin began to be used in administrative and official contexts. The territory exhibited different levels of Romanization, varying according to proximity to urban centers. These transformations shaped everyday life in lasting ways. Local identity came to coexist with imperial references. Over the centuries of Roman rule, Britain remained a strategic province of the empire. The history of Great Britain was deeply shaped by this political, military, and economic integration. British prehistory had definitively been surpassed as an isolated period. The territory became part of an imperial system stretching across vast regions of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The historical timeline advanced under Rome's direct influence. However, this dominance required constant maintenance and adaptation. The Roman Empire in Britain was not static, but dynamic and subject to internal and external challenges. This setting prepared the ground for future transformations. From this point, the narrative moves toward the tensions, resistance, and gradual weakening of Roman presence on the island.
From the earliest years of occupation, Roman rule in Britain faced constant resistance from local populations. Celtic tribes reacted in different ways to imperial presence, alternating between periods of accommodation and episodes of open confrontation. One of the most significant uprisings occurred in the 1st century AD, when groups led by local leaders rose against Roman administration. These conflicts exposed the difficulties of maintaining control over a distant and culturally diverse territory. The history of Great Britain records these episodes as early signs of the internal tensions of Roman rule. British prehistory had already given way to imperial administration, but integration was never uniform. The territory remained politically sensitive and unstable in several regions. The historical timeline reveals that resistance was a constant element of occupation. The Roman response to resistance involved military repression and administrative reorganization. Legions were redeployed to areas considered unstable, and fortifications were reinforced to secure routes in urban centers. The history of Great Britain came to be marked by cycles of conflict and pacification. Although Rome maintained military superiority, the cost of sustaining its presence gradually increased. British prehistory was long past, yet the territory had not been fully assimilated into the Roman model. Campaigns of repression ensured temporary control, but did not eliminate underlying tensions. Roman rule required constant surveillance and continuous resources. This pattern of instability became part of daily reality in Roman Britain. Imperial administration operated under permanent pressure. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, new challenges emerged, both within and beyond Britain. The Roman Empire faced political crises, internal disputes, and threats along its continental frontiers. The history of Great Britain became increasingly shaped by decisions taken far from the island, according to broader imperial priorities. Military resources were redirected to regions considered more strategic. British prehistory had been surpassed, yet the territory came to occupy a secondary position within the empire. The gradual reduction of troops affected the ability to respond to local conflicts. The territory became more vulnerable to internal instability. The
The historical timeline records this period as one of progressive weakening of Roman control. External pressures also played a significant role in the erosion of Roman rule in Britain. Groups beyond the imperial frontiers intensified incursions into peripheral regions. The need to defend multiple frontiers simultaneously strained Roman military structures. The history of Great Britain reveals that defending the island required increasing effort in a context of limited resources. British prehistory had been surpassed, yet the Roman period was approaching its conclusion. Without direct support from the legions, cities and communities were forced to reorganize. The territory ceased to receive regular directives from Rome. Imperial authority became increasingly symbolic. The historical timeline advanced toward a moment of profound transition. By the end of Roman rule, Britain found itself in a context of transformation and uncertainty. The history of Great Britain did not return to British prehistory, but entered a new phase marked by the absence of a central imperial power. Roman structures remained in the landscape, but their original functions were altered. The territory came to be governed by local leaderships across different regions. The historical timeline reveals that the end of Roman rule was not abrupt, but the result of a prolonged process. Internal resistance, external pressures, and imperial crises converged toward this outcome. Britain ceased to function as an active Roman province. This situation opened the way for profound political and social transformations. From this point onward, the narrative advances toward the post-Roman period and the reconfiguration of Great Britain.
After the end of Roman rule, Great Britain entered a period of profound political and social transformation marked by the absence of a central imperial authority. With the withdrawal of the legions, Roman administrative structures ceased to function in an integrated way, and a territory came to depend on local leadership. The history of Great Britain moved into a fragmented landscape in which former Roman cities lost part of their original function. In this context, groups from Northern Europe began to move toward the island. These movements included Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, Germanic peoples who gradually settled in different regions. British prehistory had already been surpassed, but the Roman legacy began to fade. The early Middle Ages emerged as a period of adaptation and reorganization. The territory entered a new phase in the historical timeline. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons did not occur as a uniform event, but as a gradual process over several generations. Initially, these groups established settlements in coastal areas and less urbanized regions. Over time, they advanced inland, occupying territories previously controlled by Romano-British populations. The history of Great Britain during this period reveals a complex coexistence between different groups. In some regions, cultural assimilation took place, while in others, population displacement occurred. Anglo-Saxon language and customs spread increasingly. The early Middle Ages were marked by the transformation of the island's cultural landscape. The territory began to acquire new regional identities. Political fragmentation became a central characteristic of this period. The historical timeline recorded a gradual shift in the balance of power. With the consolidation of Anglo-Saxon settlements, new kingdoms emerged that structured the political organization of Great Britain. Entities such as Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia became centers of regional power. The history of Great Britain came to be defined by multiple kingdoms coexisting and competing with one another. These political formations did not possess fixed borders and were subject to constant change. The early Middle Ages were characterized by temporary alliances, local conflicts, and frequent reorganizations. The territory ceased to be an integrated province and became a mosaic of regional powers. British prehistory was already distant, but the Roman legacy continued to influence certain structures.
The formation of England began to take shape gradually. The historical timeline advanced in a decentralized rhythm. Anglo-Saxon social organization was based on kinship ties, loyalty, and local authority. Kings and chieftains exercised power supported by warriors and regional councils. The history of Great Britain during this period shows predominantly rural societies, with economies based on agriculture and animal husbandry. Villages became central units of social organization. The early Middle Ages were not a period of intense urbanization, but one of adaptation to rural space. The territory was reorganized according to new practices of land use. British prehistory had given way to societies structured by Germanic traditions. Political authority was linked to the ability to maintain alliances and provide protection. These structures shaped daily life for local populations. The historical timeline reveals a society in constant reorganization. The Christianization of Great Britain was one of the most significant processes of the early Middle Ages. After the decline of Roman institutions, Christianity remained present in some regions, especially in the West. Over time, Christian missions were sent to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, promoting the gradual spread of the new religion. The history of Great Britain records the progressive conversion of kings and local elites. Monasteries came to play a central role in religious and cultural life. The early Middle Ages saw the emergence of centers of learning linked to the church. The territory became connected through religious networks. British prehistory and earlier belief systems were gradually replaced in some regions. Christianization contributed to cultural integration among kingdoms. This process unfolded unevenly across the territory. During this period, writing and historical record-keeping began to reappear more consistently in Great Britain. Monasteries became responsible for the preservation and production of manuscripts. The history of Great Britain began once again to be documented, albeit in a limited and regional manner. The early Middle Ages marked a partial revival of written tradition, now tied to Christianity. The territory started producing records that helped consolidate political and religious identities. British prehistory and Roman period were reinterpreted through these new sources. Latin coexisted with Anglo-Saxon languages. These records played a fundamental role in preserving historical memory. The historical timeline gained new documentary references. Written culture became a structure and element of the period. By the end of the early Middle Ages, Great Britain presented a landscape profoundly different from that of the Roman period. The Anglo-Saxons had consolidated their presence and established durable kingdoms. The history of Great Britain advanced toward a fragmented political system that was nevertheless culturally interconnected. The formation of England began to take on clearer contours. The territory was organized into kingdoms with distinct identities, linked by religion, language, and social practices. British prehistory and Roman rule had been replaced by a new order. The historical timeline continued its course, preparing the ground for new external challenges. This context opened space for even deeper changes. From this scenario, the narrative moves forward to the period of Viking invasions.
Viking invasions in Great Britain began in the late 8th century when groups originating from Scandinavia started attacking coastal regions of the island. Initially, these actions took the form of rapid raids, mainly targeting monasteries and vulnerable settlements. The history of Great Britain records these first attacks as unexpected events that caught Anglo-Saxon societies unprepared for this type of maritime threat. Vikings used light and efficient vessels capable of navigating both open seas and rivers. The early Middle Ages entered a phase marked by growing instability. British territory became integrated into Scandinavian movement routes. These initial contacts were violent, but they also established new connections. The historical timeline advanced into a period of constant external pressure.
Over the following decades, Viking incursions became more frequent and more organized. Larger groups began to settle temporarily in different regions of Great Britain, especially in the north and east. The history of Great Britain shows that these actions ceased to be merely sporadic attacks and increasingly involved seasonal occupations. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms struggled to respond in a coordinated manner to these threats. The political fragmentation inherited from the early Middle Ages limited the capacity for collective defense. The territory became the stage for recurrent conflicts. Vikings exploited local rivalries to expand their influence. The historical timeline reveals a progressive increase in Scandinavian presence. This scenario profoundly altered the regional balance of power. In the 9th century, Viking presence reached a new stage with the formation of permanent settlements. Large Scandinavian contingents came to occupy extensive areas of Great Britain, particularly in what became known as the Danelaw. The history of Great Britain records this process as a clear territorial division between areas under Viking control and regions dominated by Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In these areas, Scandinavian laws, customs, and practices began to coexist with local traditions. British territory ceased to be exclusively Anglo-Saxon in certain regions. The early Middle Ages became a period of enforced coexistence between distinct cultures. The Danelaw consolidated a lasting Viking presence. The historical timeline began to reflect this new political reality. Relations between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were not limited to military confrontation. In many regions, agreements, economic exchanges, and mutual adaptations took place. The history of Great Britain shows that prolonged contact led to gradual integration of social practices. Scandinavian traders participated in local exchange networks, while Anglo-Saxon populations adopted Viking cultural elements. The territory became a space of continuous interaction. The early Middle Ages were marked by this complexity of relationships. Legal practices, everyday customs, and artistic elements were shared. The historical timeline reveals that Viking presence left a visible legacy beyond the military sphere. These influences became part of regional identity in several areas. Contact between cultures redefined fundamental aspects of local society. Great Britain came to carry multiple layers of its historical formation. By the end of the period of Viking invasions, Great Britain presented a political and cultural landscape profoundly transformed. The history of Great Britain moved forward shaped by a prolonged experience of conflict, adaptation, and coexistence. The territory had been permanently marked by Scandinavian presence in certain regions. The early Middle Ages approached their conclusion, preparing the ground for new power struggles. The historical timeline continued its course, now influenced by centuries of interaction between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. This period did not produce definitive stability, but rather a complex reorganization. Viking heritage remained integrated in British society. It is from this context that the narrative advances towards the arrival of the Normans and a new structural transformation of Great Britain. The arrival of the Normans in England marked a profound turning point in the medieval history of Great Britain. At the beginning of the 11th century, the English kingdom was politically weakened by internal disputes and decades of external pressure resulting from Viking invasions. The death of King Edward the Confessor without direct heirs opened a succession crisis involving several claimants to the throne. Among them was William, Duke of Normandy, who asserted his claim to the English crown. The history of Great Britain records this moment as a period of growing political uncertainty. The early Middle Ages were approaching a structural transformation. English territory became the target of organized external ambitions. The historical timeline was moving toward a decisive confrontation. In 1066, William led a Norman force that crossed the English Channel and landed in southern England.
The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Hastings, where the Norman army faced the forces of King Harold II. The history of Great Britain records this battle as the central event at a Norman conquest. After Harold's defeat and death, William consolidated his advance across the territory. The English Middle Ages entered a new phase marked by the replacement of the ruling elite. The conquest was not only military, but also political and social. The territory came under a new central authority. The historical timeline records 1066 as a definitive milestone. Anglo-Saxon England gave way to Norman England. Following the conquest, the Normans initiated a profound reorganization of power in England. William was crowned king and proceeded to redistribute land among his Norman followers, almost entirely replacing the former Anglo-Saxon nobility. The history of Great Britain shows that this redistribution radically altered the social structure of the territory. Norman feudalism was established as the foundation of political and economic organization. The English Middle Ages became characterized by relations of vassalage and rigid hierarchy. Castles were constructed at strategic points to ensure military control. The territory became heavily fortified. The historical timeline records an unprecedented centralization of royal power. Norman authority was consolidated through force and administration. Norman administration introduced new mechanisms for controlling and recording the English territory. One of the most significant examples was the compilation of the Domesday Book, a detailed survey of the kingdom's lands, resources, and populations. The history of Great Britain records this document as an essential tool of medieval governance. It enabled the Norman crown to organize taxation and assert its authority over the territory. The English Middle Ages came to rely on a more systematic administration. The territory was mapped and classified in an unprecedented manner. This practice reinforced central control over distant regions. The historical timeline demonstrates the transition toward a more structured medieval state. Norman organization left lasting marks on English governance. In cultural and linguistic terms, the Norman conquest brought about profound transformations. The ruling elite adopted Norman French as the language of administration and nobility, while Old English remained prevalent among the broader population. The history of Great Britain records this period as one of intense linguistic coexistence. The English Middle Ages were marked by the gradual fusion of these traditions, giving rise to Middle English. The territory became linguistically hybrid. Legal, military, and administrative terms of French origin entered the English vocabulary. This influence reflected the new power structure. The historical timeline reveals how language evolved alongside political change. English culture was deeply reshaped. The Church also played a central role in consolidating Norman rule. Ecclesiastical reforms were implemented to align the English Church with continental standards. The history of Great Britain shows that Norman bishops and abbots replaced Anglo-Saxon religious leaders. Cathedrals and monasteries were rebuilt in the Romanesque style, transforming the urban and religious landscape. The English Middle Ages became marked by a close integration between religious authority and royal power. The territory was reorganized into more efficient dioceses. The Church became a pillar of Norman administration. The historical timeline records close cooperation between crown and clergy. This relationship strengthened the stability of a new regime. Over the following centuries, Norman rule consolidated and shaped the English Middle Ages. The history of Great Britain moved forward from a society that was deeply hierarchical, militarized, and centralized. English territory became integrated into broader political dynamics of medieval Europe. The formation of England acquired clearer contours under this new order. The English Middle Ages were not static, but marked by continuous adaptation to Norman structures. Anglo-Saxon heritage did not disappear, but was incorporated into a new system. The historical timeline continued its course, now shaped by a strengthened monarchy. This context prepared the ground for future internal conflicts and institutional transformations. From this foundation, the narrative advances toward later developments in the English monarchy and society.
The English Middle Ages were profoundly shaped by a succession of crises that structurally affected the political, economic, and social organization of the kingdom. From the 13th century onward, tensions between the monarchy and the nobility became recurrent, reflecting disputes over authority, resources, and territorial control. The history of Great Britain records this period as one of continuous instability, in which royal power began to be challenged more frequently. The centralization built after the Norman conquest faced limits imposed by regional interests. English territory became the stage for forced negotiations, armed conflicts, and rearrangements of power. The English Middle Ages advanced under constant pressure. The historical timeline reveals that these tensions were not episodic, but structural. The medieval political balance began to weaken progressively. Among the factors of crisis, prolonged military conflicts had a decisive impact on medieval England. Wars involving the English crown and continental powers required large mobilizations of resources and manpower. The history of Great Britain shows that long campaigns drained royal finances and increased the tax burden on the population. The territory began to feel the indirect effects of these conflicts, such as the disruption of productive activities and the displacement of communities. The English Middle Ages became marked by a landscape of recurring warfare. Pressure on royal administration intensified internal disputes. The historical timeline records an increase in political instability associated with these campaigns. External conflict increasingly fueled internal tension. In the economic sphere, medieval England faced periods of scarcity and imbalance that aggravated existing crises. Irregular harvests, climatic fluctuations, and logistical difficulties affected food production. The history of Great Britain records episodes of famine that struck large segments of the population. The territory, predominantly rural, became vulnerable to environmental variation. The English Middle Ages lived with sharp oscillations in the availability of basic resources. These economic difficulties widened social inequality. Pressure on peasants and laborers intensified local conflicts. The historical timeline demonstrates that economic instability was a constant element of the period. Material crisis contributed to the weakening of traditional medieval order. The Black Death, which reached England in the mid-14th century, represented one of the deepest ruptures of the English Middle Ages. The history of Great Britain records an unprecedented demographic decline, with the death of a significant portion of the population. The impact of the epidemic was immediate and long-lasting. Entire villages were abandoned, and the workforce became scarce. The territory underwent an abrupt reorganization of its social and economic structures. The English Middle Ages entered a period of accelerated transformation. Labor relations were altered in response to population loss. The historical timeline reveals that the plague redefined fundamental social dynamics. Demographic collapse made profound change unavoidable. The social consequences of medieval crises manifested themselves in revolts and internal tensions. With labor shortages, workers began to demand better conditions, while authorities attempted to preserve older arrangements. The history of Great Britain records episodes of popular uprisings connected to these disputes. The territory became a stage for confrontation between different social groups. The English Middle Ages came to live with challenges to traditional feudal order.
Local authority was contested in various regions. The historical timeline shows that these tensions did not lead to immediate rupture, but to a gradual process of change. Medieval society became more dynamic and unstable. Crises widened the gap between inherited structures and emerging realities. On the institutional level, medieval crises also affected the relationship between the king and emerging political institutions. The need to raise revenue and secure support led to the expansion of spaces for negotiation. The history of Great Britain records the gradual strengthening of assemblies and representative councils. English territory began to experience more complex forms of governance. The English Middle Ages were marked by attempts to adapt institutionally to crisis conditions. Royal power had to contend with practical limits to its authority. The historical timeline reveals a slow process of political transformation. Crises contributed to redefining the boundaries of monarchical power. Governance became more negotiated and less absolute. By the end of the Middle Ages, accumulated crises had profoundly transformed England. The history of Great Britain moved forward from a society that no longer corresponded to the initial medieval model. The territory had been reshaped by wars, epidemics, and continuous social tensions. The English Middle Ages approached their conclusion within a context of structural change. The historical timeline reveals that these crises did not destroy society, but reconfigured it. New forms of social and political organization began to emerge. Norman and feudal legacies remained present, but under new conditions. This context opened the way for broader transformations ahead. From this scenario, the narrative advances toward the period of transition and institutional renewal.
The Tudor period marked a profound reorganization of power in England following the instabilities of the late Middle Ages. With the accession of Henry VIII to the throne in 1485, the monarchy initiated a process of institutional strengthening aimed at reducing the influence of rival nobles and restoring central authority. The history of Great Britain records this moment as a conscious attempt at political stabilization after decades of dynastic conflict. English territory came to be governed with greater administrative and financial control. The English Middle Ages were approaching their end, giving way to new forms of governance. The formation of England advanced toward a more cohesive state. The historical timeline began to reflect a more structured monarchy. This context created the conditions for broader transformations. The Tudor dynasty consolidated itself throughout the 16th century through policies that reinforced the role of the crown in English political life. The centralization of power reduced the autonomy of the traditional nobility and strengthened institutions linked to the monarch. The history of Great Britain shows that administration began to operate with greater regularity and predictability. The territory was integrated through uniform laws and administrative practices. The English Renaissance developed alongside these political changes. The British monarchy came to exercise direct influence over different regions of the kingdom. The historical timeline reveals a gradual transition toward a more modern model of governance. Royal authority became the central axis of political organization. This process redefined the relationship between power and territory. The religious Reformation was one of the most significant events of the Tudor period. Under the reign of Henry VIII, England broke with papal authority and established a national church subordinated to the crown. The history of Great Britain records this movement as a profound reconfiguration of the relationship between religion and political power. English territory came to be governed by a new institutional religious structure. The dissolution of the monasteries altered land ownership and redistributed resources. The English Renaissance was marked by intense religious and administrative debates.
The British monarchy expanded its control over the spiritual life of the realm. The historical timeline reveals rapid and lasting changes. Religion became an integral part of state politics. During the Tudor period, the English Renaissance gained strength through the valorization of knowledge, the arts, and education. Humanist influences reached England through contact with continental Europe. The history of Great Britain records a growing interest in classical texts, formal education, and intellectual production. The territory began to host more active centers of learning. The formation of England was accompanied by significant cultural expansion. The English language began to assert itself as a literary and administrative medium. The historical timeline shows an environment of intellectual renewal. Written culture circulated more widely among the elites. This movement contributed to redefining English cultural identity. The English economy also underwent relevant transformations during the Tudor period. Changes in land organization, commerce, and agricultural production altered the economic dynamics of the territory. The history of Great Britain records the expansion of mercantile activities and the strengthening of a monetary economy. English territory became more intensely integrated into European trade routes. The English Renaissance was linked to these economic changes. The British monarchy employed economic policies to reinforce its power. The historical timeline reveals a society adapting to new patterns of production and exchange. These transformations affected different social layers. The economic landscape became more complex and diversified. The reign of Elizabeth I represented the peak of the Tudor period and a decisive moment of the English Renaissance. The history of Great Britain records a phase of relative stability, cultural expansion, and political affirmation on the European stage. English territory strengthened its national identity. The British monarchy consolidated itself as an emerging power. The formation of England advanced with greater internal cohesion. The historical timeline shows a balance between royal authority and administrative institutions. Culture flourished in various fields, including literature and the arts. This period contributed to projecting England beyond its borders. English society began to perceive itself in a more integrated manner. By the end of the Tudor period, England had been profoundly transformed compared to the Middle Ages. The history of Great Britain moved forward from a centralized state, a national church, and a culture influenced by the Renaissance. English territory was inserted into broader political, economic, and cultural dynamics. The formation of England reached a new level of organization. The historical timeline reveals that these changes did not end conflicts, but redefined their foundations. The Tudor legacy shaped the structures of the subsequent period. The British monarchy entered a new phase of institutional challenges. It's from this context that the narrative advances toward the developments and tensions of the Stuart period.
The rise of the Stuart dynasty to the English throne marked the beginning of a period of intense political and institutional tension in the history of Great Britain. With the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, James VI of Scotland ascended the English throne as James I, unifying the crowns but not the political systems. English territory came to be governed by a monarch who defended an expanded vision of royal authority. The history of Great Britain records the beginning of conflicts between the monarchy and Parliament. Fiscal, religious, and administrative issues became constant points of friction. The Stuart era inaugurated a phase of latent instability. The formation of England faced clear institutional limits. The historical timeline advanced toward a confrontation between competing models of power. During the reigns of James I and later Charles I, tensions deepened progressively. The monarchy sought to expand its financial autonomy, while Parliament defended its traditional role in approving taxation.
The history of Great Britain shows that the lack of political consensus paralyzed the functioning of the state at various moments. English territory became the stage for recurring disputes between royal authority and parliamentary representation. The Stuart era was marked by repeated attempts to govern without parliament. These practices intensified the climate of mistrust. The historical timeline reveals a continuous rise in political polarization. The institutional balance inherited from the Tudor period began to fracture. Religious divisions also played a central role in the crisis of the 17th century. England, shaped by the Reformation, contained a diversity of religious currents competing for influence. The history of Great Britain records conflicts among Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics as factors of social instability. The Stuart monarchy faced difficulties in managing these differences without provoking resistance. The territory increasingly linked religion and politics in an intense manner. The Stuart era became a period of ideological radicalization. Decisions at a crown were often interpreted as threats to the existing religious order. The historical timeline shows that these conflicts widened the distance between king and society. The political environment became increasingly volatile. The definitive rupture occurred in the 1640s when accumulated tensions resulted in the English Civil War. The history of Great Britain records the armed confrontation between forces loyal to the king and groups aligned with Parliament. English territory was divided by lines of conflict reflecting political, religious, and regional alliances. The Stuart era entered its most violent phase. Cities, towns, and rural areas became scenes of prolonged battles. Royal authority was directly challenged on the battlefield. The historical timeline reveals that the war was not only military but also institutional. The conflict exposed the fragilities of the English political system. Throughout the Civil War, the Parliament consolidated organized military forces, most notably the New Model Army. The history of Great Britain shows that parliamentary military and political leadership gained increasing efficiency. Territory gradually came under the control of forces opposed to the king. In 1649, Charles I was tried and executed, ending in unprecedented fashion the reign of an English monarch. The Stuart era suffered an unparalleled rupture. The monarchy was temporarily abolished. The historical timeline records the transition to a republican regime. England entered a period of radical political experimentation. Power began to be exercised on new institutional foundations. During the Republican period, known as the Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell emerged as the central figure of government. The history of Great Britain records a regime marked by the concentration of executive power and attempts to reorganize the state. English territory was administered under strong military control. The Stuart era, though interrupted, continued to influence institutional debates. The Republican government faced internal and external challenges. The historical timeline reveals a period of continued political instability. The absence of a monarchy did not result in lasting consensus. The political system remained in search of balance. The Republican experiment exposed practical limits to the reorganization of power. In 1660, the monarchy was restored with the accession of Charles II, bringing the Republican period to an end. The history of Great Britain records the Restoration as an attempt to stabilize the political system after decades of conflict. English territory came to coexist with a monarchy shaped by recent experience. The Stuart era continued on new institutional foundations. Royal authority was re-established, but with clearer limits. The historical timeline shows that the Civil War had permanently altered the relationship between king and parliament. Power came to be negotiated more explicitly. This context redefined the foundations of the English state. From these transformations, the narrative advances toward the economic and social changes of the centuries that followed.
The Industrial Revolution marked one of the most profound transformations in the history of the United Kingdom, permanently altering its economic and social structure. From the late 18th century onward, Great Britain underwent the gradual transition from a predominantly rural economy to a system based on mechanized industrial production. New machines, initially powered by water and later by steam, transformed production methods. The history of Great Britain records the emergence of factories as centers of concentrated labor. British territory began to be reshaped by industrial complexes. The formation of England entered a new economic phase. The historical timeline moved forward at an accelerated pace. Society began to experience entirely new rhythms of work. Industrial growth triggered intense urbanization across several regions of the United Kingdom. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool expanded rapidly, attracting populations from the countryside in search of employment. The history of the United Kingdom shows that this population movement profoundly altered social organization. Urban territory became denser and more complex. Infrastructures such as roads, canals, and railways expanded to sustain production and commerce. Modern British history records this period as one of spatial reorganization. Urban life gained central importance. The historical timeline reflects the continuous growth of industrial cities. The British landscape was deeply transformed. Working conditions during the Industrial Revolution became a central element of a new social reality. The history of Great Britain records long working hours, extensive use of female and child labor, and environments concentrated within factories. Industrial territory came to gather large numbers of workers. The formation of England was accompanied by new relationships between employers and employees. The organization of labor became more rigid and disciplined. Modern British history shows the emergence of debates regarding labor regulation. The historical timeline reveals growing social tensions. The world of work assumed a central position in daily life. The Industrial Revolution also drove continuous technological innovations that expanded British productive capacity. Textile machinery, steam engines, and transportation systems transformed the rhythm of the economy. The history of the United Kingdom records a significant increase in production in both domestic and international trade. British territory became a hub for the circulation of goods. The history of Great Britain highlights the integration between industry, science, and technology. The formation of England increasingly depended on innovation. The historical timeline shows a chain of technological advances. This process reinforced Britain's position on the international stage. During the 19th century, the Victorian era consolidated many of the transformations initiated by the Industrial Revolution. The long reign of Queen Victoria coincided with a period of economic expansion, institutional stability, and demographic growth. The history of the United Kingdom records the consolidation of an urban middle class. British territory came to value consumption and leisure patterns associated with urban life. Modern British history shows the strengthening of social values related to family, work, and order. The formation of England progressed toward a more complex society. The historical timeline reveals an integration between economic growth and social organization. Daily life was profoundly reconfigured. The Industrial Revolution also drove continuous technological innovations that expanded British productive capacity. Textile machinery, steam engines, and transportation systems transformed the rhythm of the economy. The history of the United Kingdom records a significant increase in production in both domestic and international trade. British territory became a hub for the circulation of goods.
The history of Great Britain highlights the integration between industry, science, and technology. The formation of England increasingly depended on innovation. The historical timeline shows a chain of technological advances. This process reinforced Britain's position on the international stage. During the 19th century, the Victorian era consolidated many of the transformations initiated by the Industrial Revolution. The long reign of Queen Victoria coincided with a period of economic expansion, institutional stability, and demographic growth. The history of the United Kingdom records the consolidation of an urban middle class. British territory came to value consumption and leisure patterns associated with urban life. Modern British history shows the strengthening of social values related to family, work, and order. The formation of England progressed toward a more complex society. The historical timeline reveals an integration between economic growth and social organization. Daily life was profoundly reconfigured.
The beginning of the 20th century found the United Kingdom as a consolidated global power, yet already exposed to structural tensions accumulated throughout the previous century. The history of the United Kingdom records that despite economic and military strength, the country faced internal challenges linked to advanced industrialization and growing social demands. British territory was deeply integrated into the international system. Modern British history began to be marked by an environment of competition among major powers. The formation of England and Great Britain had reached a high level of institutional complexity. The historical timeline moved toward a period of global conflicts. The international context grew increasingly unstable. These conditions prepared the ground for the great wars of the century. The First World War represented a decisive rupture in the history of Great Britain. The United Kingdom mobilized human, industrial, and financial resources on an unprecedented scale. The history of the United Kingdom records British participation on multiple fronts and the direct involvement of society in the war effort. The territory was reorganized to meet the demands of the conflict. Modern British history shows profound changes in the economy and in the role of the state. The war accelerated social transformations already underway. The historical timeline reveals the lasting impact of the conflict on the population. The post-war period brought economic and political instability. The British world had been deeply altered. Between the two wars, the United Kingdom experienced a period of reconstruction and uncertainty. The history of the United Kingdom records economic difficulties, unemployment, and social tensions. British territory underwent adjustments in industry and international trade. Modern British history shows efforts to preserve institutional stability amid rapid change. The formation of England maintained its political structure, but faced new challenges. The historical timeline reveals a phase of gradual adaptation. The relative decline of economic influence began to become visible. These conditions preceded another global-scale conflict. The European landscape once again moved toward war. The Second World War marked another central moment in the history of Great Britain. British territory was directly affected by bombings and the total mobilization of society. The history of the United Kingdom records coordination among government, industry, and the civilian population. The war effort required strict economic planning and social reorganization. Modern British history shows that the conflict redefined the role of the state. The historical timeline highlights the importance of this period for national cohesion. At the end of the war, the United Kingdom emerged victorious, but economically weakened. The foundations of the imperial world had been irreversibly altered. In the post-war period, the United Kingdom began a broad internal reorganization. The history of the United Kingdom records the creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service, the NHS.
British territory came to rely on public policies focused on social security. Modern British history shows the expansion of the state's role in economy and society. The formation of England entered a new phase of social organization. The historical timeline indicates an effort toward reconstruction and stability. At the same time, the British Empire entered an accelerated process of dissolution. Former colonies gained independence over the following decades. During the Cold War, the United Kingdom repositioned itself on the international stage. The history of Great Britain records its role as a strategic ally of the United States and a central member of Western alliances. British territory became part of a new geopolitical order. Modern British history shows economic and industrial transformations throughout the second half of the 20th century. Structural reforms altered traditional sectors of the economy. The historical timeline reveals alternating periods of growth and crisis. British society became more diverse and urban. Political institutions adapted to a rapidly changing world. At the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the United Kingdom faced new challenges linked to globalization and European integration. The history of the United Kingdom records intense debates over sovereignty, economy, and national identity. British territory underwent significant political transformations. Modern British history includes events such as economic reforms, changes in the role of the state, and institutional redefinitions. The historical timeline reaches the period of Brexit and withdrawal from the European Union. The death of Elizabeth II marked the symbolic end of an era in the British monarchy. The contemporary United Kingdom stands as the result of successive historical layers. The narrative now advances toward the final synthesis of this long historical trajectory.
Throughout this long historical timeline, the territory of Great Britain emerges as a space shaped by successive layers of occupation, transformation, and reorganization. From British prehistory, with its earliest human groups adapting to an insular environment, to the complex industrial and urban societies of recent centuries, each period left deep and lasting marks. Celtic peoples, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans all contributed to the formation of England and to the consolidation of enduring political and cultural structures. The history of Great Britain was not the result of a single decisive moment, but of a continuous sequence of change. Each stage prepared the ground for the next. This gradual accumulation explains the complexity of the modern United Kingdom. When viewed as a whole, the historical narrative reveals continuity alongside transformation. The British monarchy, one of the central institutions of this trajectory, underwent profound adaptations over the centuries. From a fragmented power during the English Middle Ages, it evolved into a more centralized structure, passed through institutional crises during the Stuart era, and redefined its limits throughout modern British history. This process did not occur in isolation, but always in interaction with Parliament, society, and economic change. The formation of England was directly linked to this dynamic balance of forces. The monarchy did not remain static, but adjusted to the demands of each historical period. The historical timeline shows this continuous adaptation. The result was the consolidation of a distinctive political system. This system still influences the functioning of the United Kingdom today. The British Empire represented another central axis of this history, connecting the island to different parts of the world through trade, administration, and the movement of people. Imperial expansion was closely linked to the transformations of the Industrial Revolution and the technological advances of the Victorian era. At the same time, its decline in the 20th century marked a profound redefinition of Britain's role on the global stage.
The history of the United Kingdom records this process as a transition from imperial power to a more concentrated role based on alliances and diplomacy. British territory ceased to be the center of a formal empire, but retained significant cultural and political influence. The English language and institutions shaped during this period remain widely spread. This imperial legacy continues to shape international relations. It is a historical inheritance that endures. In the post-war and Cold War context, the United Kingdom adapted to a new world order defined by strategic alliances and rapid economic change. The history of Great Britain shows a country constantly adjusting to globalization and the transformations of modern capitalism. Internal reforms altered traditional productive sectors. British society became more diverse, urban, and globally connected. The historical timeline reveals that these changes did not break with the past, but reinterpreted its foundations. The formation of England and the United Kingdom continued to evolve. Long-standing institutions coexisted with new social realities. This capacity for adaptation remains a central characteristic of British history. Recent events, such as Brexit and the death of Elizabeth II, closed important symbolic cycles in the history of the United Kingdom. They do not represent a definitive end, but the continuation of a historical process in constant motion. Modern British history continues to be built upon structures inherited from the past. British territory remains the result of choices accumulated over centuries. The historical timeline does not end, it moves forward. The contemporary United Kingdom reflects both its ancient heritage and its recent transformations. Understanding this complete trajectory allows for a clearer view of the present. History, in this sense, remains open. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive more videos like this. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in this kind of topic, take a look at the video about the history of the Persian Empire, which might interest you as well. Thank you very much for watching till the end, and see you in the next video.